On the left, you're dealing with a climate and economic map of the former Soviet space. These maps are on their side, so if you turn your head, it's okay. If you're on the right, same map, but now we're looking at population density. Now, on the map on the right, the population density, that lighter color of orange, is roughly the population density of Kansas if you remove Topeka and Kansas City. So yes, you have neighbors, you've probably lost track of the details of their lives. If you go to the left, the green zone is what they call the Russian wheat belt. That is the primary agricultural zone in the former Soviet world. It is the least productive of the major agricultural zones worldwide. The problem is primarily climate. In the summer, it's about the same as western Kansas, so hot and dry. In the winter, it's about the same as northeastern Alberta, so cold, dry, windy. The output per acre is the lowest productivity of any wheat zone, any agricultural zone in the world. And the income that comes from that agricultural production is so low and so erratic that the Russians, even today, have not been able to build a national road network. You want to do anything at scale in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, you have to move things by rail. It's your only option. Now, if you go to the south, to the yellow, to the left, you're in desert, completely empty. If you go to the right, to the north, to the blue, you're in tundra and taigai, also completely empty. But what makes the Russians drink is the beige, the stuff on the shoulders, territories that are completely useless from their definition, but they're flat and they're wide open. And you can totally shove a Mongol horde through that. The Russians have been invaded 50 odd times in their history. Every time the invader has made it to the green where they actually live, the Russians have never driven them out. It's been the weather. The Russians have discovered over the last 350 years that the only way that they can protect the wheat belt is if they expand beyond it through the beige and reach a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a panzer division through. And then forward position those rail-supplied military forces in the access points between those barriers, static defense, plug the gaps. If they do that, they can prevent the war from coming to them. That's the only defensive strategy they have. And this is everything that Putin has attempted to do in the last 23 years. This is the Kazakh intervention and the Karabakh War and the Georgia War and the Crimea War. It's about getting troops into those gaps and plugging them. The problem for Ukraine, of course, is not that it controls any of these gaps, but it's on the way to two of them. The Russians were always going to do this. They were always going to try to not just take parts of Ukraine, but all of it. And then they would move beyond into the countries that actually control the territories they care about. That's Poland, that's Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These are all NATO allies. We've always known this was going to go down. Now, who here is not from Texas? The scale of what the Russians are attempting here, we have a hard time wrapping our minds around. I mean, the United States is a big country, but it's nothing compared to the sheer physical size of Russia. Their borders are 3 times as long. They're trying to patrol them with a population that's half as big. It was always going to be a desperate fight. All right. That's the big strategic picture. Let's look at the tactical. The dotted lines on this map are those all-important rail connections. The deep red are the territories that the Russians controlled at the end of the last war in 2014. So anyone who tells you that, if you just give the Russians a little bit, they'll stop. No, because this was the 7th time they've done this since 1992. And then third, those pinker areas are the areas that the Russians held as of the 1st of September in the current war. This is Kherson. It's the only territory west of the Dnieper River that the Russians were able to capture earlier in the war. And the Ukrainians made it very clear around August, actually July, that this is where they were going to go first. This was the territory they were going to try to liberate because it was on the other side of the river. It would be easier to do. The Russians saw these advertisements, forward position about another 20,000 troops there, the best troops that they had. Now, as we all know, that wasn't the end of the story. I mean, yes, the assault did begin on September 1, but there was also a second piece to it because the Ukrainians watched to see where the Russians pulled those troops from and launched an assault there in Kharkiv. And without the Russian forces in place, the Kharkiv front collapsed in 5 days. Best of all, you'll notice just south of where those arrows connect, there's a little dingleberry of pink. That is the city of Izium. That was their forward positioned base. They were planning on launching multiple assaults from that. It fell in 36 hours. But since it was their forward logistics base, that's where all their tanks and all their artillery were. And so in 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more equipment from the Russians than they started the war with. And territory switched hands. What we're going through right now is a logistical war, because remember, the Russians have to have rail connections. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge. This is the only rail connection between mainland Russia and the entirety of the southern front. And a couple months back, somebody blew it up, and so now the Russians have to move everything by truck. This is a problem. The Russians only started the war with about 3,000 tactical support trucks for their entire military.
The Ukraine-Russia war has been raging for several years now, and one of the key battlegrounds in this conflict has been the agricultural infrastructure in the region. Both Ukraine and Russia have significant agricultural industries, and controlling the infrastructure that supports these industries has been a strategic priority for both sides. In recent news, the conflict over agricultural infrastructure has intensified, with reports of increased attacks on farms, silos, and other key agricultural assets. These attacks have caused significant damage to the agricultural industry in the region, and have resulted in food shortages and higher prices for basic staples. At the same time, both Ukraine and Russia have been working to strengthen their own agricultural industries, with significant investments in modernization, technology, and infrastructure. This has led to a growing disparity between the agricultural capabilities of the two sides, with Ukraine struggling to keep up with Russia's more advanced and efficient farming methods. Despite these challenges, many farmers in the region remain committed to their work and are doing their best to keep their businesses going despite the conflict. They continue to plant and harvest crops and are working to find new markets and customers for their products. Overall, the battle for agricultural infrastructure in the Ukraine-Russia war remains a key factor in the conflict, and is likely to continue to be a focus of both sides for the foreseeable future. Recent news in the Ukraine-Russia war has highlighted the importance of agricultural infrastructure as a key battleground. Both sides have targeted farms, grain elevators, and other food production facilities, causing significant damage to the region's food supply. As tensions continue to escalate, the impact on the agricultural sector is likely to be felt for years to come. As of March 4, 2023, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia continues to heavily impact agricultural infrastructure in the region. Recent reports suggest that both sides are targeting farmland, silos, and other essential agricultural structures, leading to food shortages and an increase in food prices. The situation remains unstable and unpredictable.